So we are continuing our tour through through the history of how urban forests sort of play out, how urban vegetation plays a role in cities, and so we're to the time period of essentially the Middle Ages here, which is sort of a broad broad term, and I'm not gonna make it specific, but one of the defining things here, and one of the interesting things, the reasons why I wanted to make this lecture more than just the history in the United States, is that a lot of the presence of urban vegetation can sort of corresponds to some major historical events in human civilization. So one of the things that sort of set off the Middle Ages in general was the fall of the Roman Empire. And when that happened, there was a loss, an extreme loss of wealth, sort of cascaded through all of the economic systems and through lots of different civilizations and areas. And so if we were to sort of, and just before I get into that, that loss of wealth corresponds to some things that we see in terms of urban vegetation that exists within cities, because it kind of reflects what's going on in those cities at the time. So we're going to put this in relative terms, we're not going to put actual dates here, but we're just sort of looking at some patterns. After the fall of Rome, you have that loss of societal wealth, and that corresponds to basically an extinction of trees from urban areas. I mean, not like extinct, and these species weren't going extinct, but there's a lack of urban vegetation, and urban areas kind of regressed to a more simpler time wherein maybe there was more conflict, maybe they were using their resources more, and other things were more important in these times, and they weren't really emphasizing or vegetation in these urban areas. And then over time, some of that information got lost, that there used to be these large gardens and in certain areas like Greece and Rome had green belts and things like that. That information was kind of lost for a long time. And so we see this period where we look at records from old cities, and there's just no reference to gardens or anything that might resemble a park, or anything, or orchards or anything like that. But over time, we do see a slow reincorporation. You get this stark period where there's nothing, and then you have this slow reincorporation of urban vegetation into medieval gardens. And a lot of that there were a lot of similarities where nobles had these medieval gardens, and the public didn't necessarily have access to those. But you're starting to see urban vegetation slowly being incorporated back into the urban environment. And so that's sort of, I mean, there's not much to say about the Middle Ages except that there really was not much urban vegetation. It's kind of a stark period if you're living in an urban area. And so that kind of transition us into the Renaissance area, where you're starting to really see this pick up again, or the swing back towards incorporating vegetation into the urban environment. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that a lot of historical texts were found at this time. So the creation of the first there were these things called Renaissance gardens, or sort of how we think of them, that were sort of an outgrowth of the renewed interest in classical texts. So they found these historical documents that referred to the fact that there were gardens in Egypt and Greece and Rome, and there were green belts, and there were all these things, and people found these and said, oh, we can do this in our cities again. And so you started to see that sort of thing being reincorporated, and they kind of expanded upon it in this time period a little bit, where you're seeing something that looks a little bit more like, I think this comes from Italy, but you're seeing something that looks a little bit more like what you might consider to be a park. And this is sort of an example of a Renaissance garden that certainly not everyone would have had access to something like this. But it's sort of getting back, or vegetation is being more incorporated, something that looks more like urban forestry today, and something that looks more like more of a modern park than probably what you would have seen, in Rome or Greece even. And they were doing other things as well. So, this is the Renaissance era was coming after the Middle Ages, and a lot of the conflict was starting to die down. You're not having as much conflict, and urban areas are starting to develop and become more complex and grow. And what they kind of had was like, a lot of urban areas from the Middle Ages had these big walls, where they were like had defenses and they were trying to withstand sieges and all these sorts of things. But you didn't really need that anymore once that conflict died down, and so they're left with this structure. It's like, what do they do with it? One of the interesting things, and I didn't know this until I looked into this stuff, but they actually planted trees on tops of their defense wall. Like they had these huge defense walls that would surround their cities and urban areas, and they're like, well, what should we do with these? So they don't need them anymore because they're not at war all the time. So they actually planted trees on top of them. I think that's actually kind of interesting. And they had promenades. You start seeing these show up in areas like maybe around Paris and in Italy, where you see walkways being planted with trees and courtyards and places where carriages are being drawn. They're actually planting. So it's sort of starting to look like street trees, not necessarily in the same format that we have them today, but they're starting to. And they had like courtyards where they might play like, I don't know, some sort of game or something, and they planted trees in there. So starting to get swing towards a little bit more like what something we might recognize in today's cities. And what's interesting is, this is early plans for the city of Philadelphia, which is, one of the oldest cities in the United States and predates the actual United States. And so this was actually the first United States city. It wasn't the United States at the time, but when they drew up the plans for Philadelphia, it was the first city that would later become the United States to incorporate public parks. And so you can see some of those parks that they actually drew up in the plans. People, I guess, people you may not associate Philadelphia with the Renaissance era, but that's how far back some of these cities in the United States do actually go. But if we move forward a little bit, we get into the age of enlightenment here. And one of the things you're seeing here that sort of in terms of civilization that marks this period is the French and American revolutions. And so what was sort of happening during the Renaissance era is that you have a growing middle class. So the middle class is expanding, they're getting more wealth, they're becoming more educated. And one thing they want and see is they see this ruling class that has so much wealth and they have access to so much extravagance, in their life, and that created a lot of animosity, and that inequality was what sparked a lot of the revolutions. Probably more so in France. American Revolution was a little bit more nuanced and it had more to do with certainly those things, but also governance and things like that. But I would say, inequality was at the heart of a lot of both of these revolutions. And so basically you see this demand from the middle class and the public in general to have some of these resources that the ruling class had had exclusively up until now. And you might not think that translates to urban forestry, but if we think back to Egypt and even throughout all of history, it was mostly the ruling class that had these private sort of parks or private gardens. And so one thing you see is that the public wants a living condition that's actually more enjoyable, and what they see that the ruling classes had, and they have. And so you start to see that reflected in the cities during this time. And so, one of the early versions of like a totally public park was Vauxhall Garden, which is, I think, Vauxhall Park. Those yeah, led to Vauxhall Park in London. And this was sort of an early public park where basically anyone could come in here. Originally, it was anyone could come in here, and it was just a park. You could hang out, and there were trees and kids could play and you could sort of relax. And there's even records of where they would bring in like vendors, like there would be people selling like baked goods and you could get, I don't know, coffee or tea and stuff, and it was just like a cool place to hang out. It was a park. Eventually, they actually ended up. I think if I remember right, they ended up in the later days of the existence of this area, ended up charging fees because they turns out the people in the upper class don't actually want to spend time with the lower class, and so there's more animosity. But it was still a move, a shift towards giving some of these resources to the public that previously they hadn't had access to. And something else, just a little note that I thought was interesting. At the same time period, this is sort of during the period of there's a lot of exploration. There's travel going back and forth from like the new North America and Central America, sort of the new world and the old world, and new species are being found and things are getting moved around a lot. And so this was around the time period that the ginkgo, which is like one of the oldest like living, like it's like a fossil relic tree, like it's around, but only because we plant it, was being sort of reintroduced to a lot of areas. And so this comes from a quote from this book that we'll probably go back to at some point, but it's, the first ginkgo seeds were long believed to have been brought to Europe from Japan in 1693 by a physician botanist with the Dutch East India Company. And what's kind of interesting is that those seeds were brought to a botanical garden in Holland, and by the mid 1700s, the Kew Gardens had acquired its first ginkgo, and that ginkgo gave it, the offspring from that ginkgo was probably what were the ginkgos that came to Alexander Hamilton's grounds, which you may not know this, but he was Alexander Hamilton had and a lot of the founding fathers had these like large estates where they liked to plant trees, and it was sort of another example of sort of like people who had wealth could collect these like exotic species things, and they would plant these things. So that definitely happened here too. But it's sort of an interesting lineage from like the seeds that came from Japan to Holland and to England, that you can sort of trace a direct lineage to probably most of the ginkgos that now exist in the United States. Were probably from this direct lineage here. So it's kind of interesting. And this is a really good book. We might come back to it. It's sort of, I forget the exact title, but anyway, yeah, it talks about the history of the urban forestry in the United States. So that was a cool little story. But yeah, so starting to see in these time periods things shifting towards the public having a little bit more access to resources in terms of their urban living conditions than what they had previously had access to.